Good afternoon and good morning to you all, colleagues. On behalf of our department at the University of the Western Cape, I just want to add our heartfelt congratulations on your 70th birthday, Professor Smit. Please accept our gratitude and appreciation for your invaluable and deep contribution that you made to the then Faculty of Theology and now the Department of Religion and Theology at UWC. I wish you every blessing as you have blessed us through your theology, but also through your humanity. And it is indeed a privilege for us to be part of the symposium. To the rest of you, dear friends, welcome to the second day of the symposium on the occasion of Professor Smith's birthday. This session is entitled God's Electing Grace. And we will have three presentations, one from Hanna, Reichel, Rothney, Tshaka, and Nadia, Marais, and we'll do it in that order. I encourage you to post your questions and comments in the chat or in the question and answer section. So now, allow me to introduce Hanna. And Hanna, I must apologize, but I am not good at what looks like German here, but I will try my best. Hanna Reichel.
My Afrikaans is also very bad, so.
Okay, wonderful. Hanna Reichel is Associate Professor of Reformed Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary, after having taught previously at Heidelberg University and Halle-Wittenberg University in Germany. Their book Theologie als Bekentenis Karl Barth's contextuele lecture, take it lectures des Heidelberger Catechismus, the catechesis, I take it, received the Lautenschlager Award for Theological Promise and the Ernst Wolf Award. Reichel is currently working on two major projects. One develops perspectives of doing theology, and I quote, after method, drawing on Karl Barth, Marcella Altua's Reed, queer theory and design theory. The other one offers a theological account of surveillance technologies and cultures, tentatively titled Political Theologies of Omniscience. Other interests include Christology, digital theology, and epistemic justice. Welcome and thank you for agreeing to do this lecture. You have about 15 minutes. We can push it to around about 18, but thank you very much, and I give the floor to you.
Thank you so much for this friendly introduction, and it's a special pleasure to be here today and think with Dirk and on this occasion of honoring him, because he's absolutely my favorite colleague here. Don't tell this to anyone else. I have entitled my notes, and maybe I can share my screen. I really liked the way this worked for Ernest yesterday. I entitled my talk Swords to Plowshares on Using Election. Imagine you find a piece of metal with a sharp edge. What you might do with it will depend on a couple of different things. It will partially depend on the characteristics of the blade, right? Is it pointed or rounded? Does it have a handle, or is it set in a mold board? These kinds of things will let you know how you might want to use it. But what you imagine you could do with it will, on another part, depend on your own characteristics, your experience, your skills, your capabilities, your needs, and not least of all, your imagination. Remember the saying, to the man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So depending on where you are right now, you might have very different kinds of ideas that jump to mind of what you would do with a blade. And in design theory, what an object may most likely and consistently be used for is described by the notion of affordances. Affordances are defined, this is an old definition, but it's still used. Affordances describe a relationship between the properties of the object and the capabilities of the agent that determine just how the object could possibly be used. So it's the relationship between the properties of the blade and the capabilities of the user that determine its potential uses. Now imagine you found a blade in your tradition. The word of God, for example, right? Which according to the letter to the Hebrews is living and active, sharper than a two-edged sword. So we talk about the word of God as sharp as a sword, but does that necessarily make it an instrument of destruction? Could it be put to other uses? So many of Jesus's parables draw on imagery of agrarian life more than on war. So maybe the affordance of the sharpness and activity, the liveness and edge that is characteristic of this object, the word of God, may be much closer to that of a plowshare than that of a sword. Right? Both are similar, they have similar affordances, and in the Bible, we even have different stories where blades that are found, and even metaphorical blades that are found in tradition, can be turned one way or the other, but most literally, of course, in the prophetic invocations of the swords to plowshare visions. So if you found a blade, you could stick it on a handle and use it as a sword, or you could stick it on a mold board and use it as a plowshare, which is the theologically correct use. So my wager here is what an object is cannot be found apart from its use. Its truth is in its use, or its use, to cite one of my favorite theologians, matters. Now imagine you found a doctrine. A doctrine is admittedly a different kind of object, but let's consider it as an object nevertheless. What you imagine you might do with it will again depend both on your own characteristics, your situation, your capabilities, and on some of the properties of this object, the doctrine itself. So what if now the agent is the human being, the object was God, and the theological relation in which they found themselves, the affordance structure, was one of election? What would be the doctrine's affordances? What uses might doctrine be put to then? One of cutting or one of plowing? One of judgment or one of comfort? One of separation or one of grace? And many of us were inspired by the 2017 retirement lectures at Stellenbosch University, which in different forms, the episode also appears in the Warfield lecture, where Dirk Smit recounts how he indeed found a doctrine and repurposed it, we might say. He tells us the story of his rediscovery of Baving's teaching on election in the midst of the Soweto uprising. And in this context, he even likens it to Luther's discovery of the justice of God, which kind of turned everything on its head. And Smit discovered that the doctrine of election is, but not only, right, is not only a sharp and two-edged sword, but that it can be used as a plowshare. Like the justice of God, the doctrine of election had long been an instrument of judgment and separation, cutting people into different categories, elect and reprobate. But Smit found it actually afforded quite a different kind of use as well, and maybe a use that ultimately constituted a better fit between the characteristics of the object, who God is, and the subject, the situation of the human being. And he made this discovery when reading Baving. And you might know this quote, it's really beautiful. I'll read part of it again. Both for unbelievers and believers, the doctrine of election is a source of inexpressibly great comfort. If it were based on justice and merit, all would be lost. But now that election operates according to grace, there's hope even for the most wretched. The purpose of election, its use, we might say, is not, as it's so often proclaimed, to turn off the many, but to invite all to participate in the riches of God's grace in Christ. So Dirk Smit talks in his reflections about how in the South African apartheid context, in order to be reformed, we had to learn how to read our reformed tradition against tradition. We had to reclaim our own church and tradition from and against our own church and tradition. We had to read our historical figures against their own practices. We had to read our confessional documents against their own reception histories. And I want to suggest that we can think of this, this turn, right? The reading tradition against tradition as a kind of turn in use, a different kind of use. That is very much based on a discernment of the affordances of this object, the doctrine that is found. Because there is no sense really in this tradition against tradition, there is no sense of either open-endedness and relativity between the divergent interpretations of tradition here. There is rather a very clear sense of a rightful use versus a misuse. There's a clear sense of a need to identify, revitalize, and reappropriate the gospel, which our oppressors have distorted and idolatrously used to legitimate their own selfish ends. So it's a competition, or like a, it's a defiance of this kind of use. So reading the tradition against tradition then means staking a claim about the rightful use, one that, as Smit states, citing Alan Dusak, seeks to restore to its rightful owners what has been taken from them. So this reading of tradition against tradition, we might say, is primarily motivated by a stubborn faithfulness to the original object and its affordances. And it's not only about the fact that, as Smit states, words matter because they move and affect those who hear, which is already, right, a use-centered perspective. But it is, of course, about how they move and affect those who hear and what they move them to. So it's about the kind of use that it's put to. So in short, Smit's approach about the potential uses of this doctrine is about its affordances. And as I have just very briefly sketched, these affordances are not just a secondary characteristic of the object in question. They very much make it what it is. Smit's concern is, of course, that the effects of doctrine should themselves be an expression of and a witness to the gospel that the doctrine is talking about. In that sense, we might say that Smit's method of reading tradition against tradition has more in common with a Pauline hermeneutic of the spirit over against the letter, or, as I want to invoke here, a prophetic approach of turning swords into plowshares. Theologically speaking, it may not even be a hermeneutic at all, but simply a way of using election by doing election. So as by talking about election, participation in and response to what I want to call electio continua, it's a making use of the affordances of the doctrine of election for the purpose of using election rightly. So let me explain a little bit more what I mean here, and thus we dive into the doctrine proper. So interestingly, Smit describes his rediscovery of the gospel of election under its traditional doctrinal interpretations, not simply as some kind of turning point from some hermeneutic to another, but he describes this discovery as itself an effect of God's electing grace. On the realization that the necessarily restless memory may suddenly become alive again and fragments may surprise us as they did him, Smit notes, well, God's free grace and election has often had such an effect. So when Smit states that election, the biblical doctrine of God's faithfulness and overpowering grace, is rediscovered in times of distress and persecution, we might thus infer that such rediscovery is itself an affordance of an original design. In design theory, we might distinguish between the design as in the idea, the blueprint of it, right? As well as the original act of creating an object, designing it, bringing it into being as what it is, from the affordances of the object thus created. And of course, the affordances are very much shaped by the original design. In fact, the designer will most likely be invested in creating the right affordances to carry out their idea and purpose, to teach the user implicitly to what use the designed object is to be put and how to use the designed object. So the designing will, of course, try to shape the affordances. But while the original design is to some extent controlled by the designer, the affordances pertain to the relationship between the created object and the user in an environment. And so they're also the site of negotiation between the capabilities, needs, and skills of the user and the characteristics of the object. So there is some measure of liberty and even openness and uncertainty here, where potential uses might be anticipated by the designer, but also unanticipated. And I want to say that this is very much so in election. There's an original intention and there's a reassertion in ongoing negotiation of what it means. And this is intertwined and creates specific potential uses. But it also helps to distinguish, right, maybe between this original design and then the affordances that I was talking about. And to do that, I want to distinguish between an electio originalis and an electio continua. Much like in the doctrine of creation, people have distinguished between a creatio originalis and a creatio continua. So what might that mean? Well, we can say that from God's history with Israel and God's presence and promise in Jesus of Nazareth, we glean a sustained and reiterated and reinforced will for community that asserts itself anew in individual acts throughout history, acting and reacting to human reactions. Similarly, right, as we talked about, from the rediscovery of the doctrine of election in times of distress and strife, and from finding that it affords comfort to the afflicted and oppressed, we might infer that God doesn't let go of the objects of God's election and instead continues to unsettle them faithfully, inviting them to respond once more to the grace that expresses itself in election by putting grace to use, extending grace in order to make use of grace. And so I want to postulate that the rediscovery of doctrine is itself the expression of an electio continua, which actualizes the purpose of an electio originalis. And of course, if we look at these two terms, we might say that from these experiences, as in the rediscovery of doctrine, as in the different acts of God in history, we might infer, and theologians do this, right, a prehistorically eternal act of electio originalis in God's self. So the electio continua, God's sustained faithfulness to election through the course of history, but that asserts and reiterates itself in individual new acts, points theologians to an original design, an original act of election in God's self, in which God elects God's self to be God for and with the human being, and in which God elects the human being for community with God's self. And this is, of course, a reformulation of Barth's famous doctrine, the way he turns the doctrine of election, where he says predestination, in this case, almost like a synonym. So election is not in the first place about the human being, but about God, who predestined God's self to be God for us. So election does not describe something that happens merely to the human side of the relation and then to some humans over others at that. And it also does not merely describe an act of God as distinct from and secondary to God's being that then extends to some humans over others. But instead, election centrally and irrevocably defines who God is in God's self, in God's eternal decree, God's eternal self-determination, or as I want to say, the electio originalis. And the affordances of election retroactively define this design for us, who God is by way of the uses God is put to through God's self-application in election. And of course, theologically, the personification even of this electio originalis, but then also of the electio continua is Jesus Christ, the original act of design is, of course, the electio originalis of the eternal Son. But the affordances of the so designed object, Jesus Christ, are what constitutes the electio continua, where the object of election becomes its subject, and as its subject, its use, puts into use the original intention of election, God for the human being.
3 more minutes, and then
The human being for God in Barth's language. So, right, in this analogy, Jesus Christ corresponds to the designed object, which both manifests the intentions of the designer, the electio originalis, and mediates them in this relation of affordances with the user in the electio continua. And thus it's, and because this is in Christ and it's grace and good news, this is why Barth then famously formulates that the election of grace is the sum of the gospel. Because by way of this affordance structure, election is the gift that keeps on giving. It's not a self-contained truth once and for all, but the very relation between God and the human being that extends itself as faithfulness, mercy, and grace, and that can be put to use toward faithfulness, mercy, and grace. So I'll have to speed this up. Right, this was kind of a backward perspective. We inferred backwards. There must have been an electio originalis. Theologians have also formulated it the other way around. Bavinck writes that in election, and I want to say in electio originalis, humans are strictly passive, but in the covenant of grace, they play an active role. Right, this inception, the original act of design, is unilateral, as in design, right? The designer creating something. But then by way of the affordance structure, it enters into this negotiating relationship that becomes bilateral. And I think that's very much the case in election as well. So let me conclude. At the end of the first Warfield lecture, Smit asks us, whether to believe in and to confess election shouldn't be to recognize even the most unworthy and degraded human being in our eyes as creatures of God and objects of God's eternal love, so that there is hope even for the most wretched. Shouldn't we have learned that from election? The word of God may be a double-edged blade, and the doctrine of election has certainly been used as a weapon in the past. But maybe, just maybe, this blade could be used as a plowshare rather than a sword. And maybe this was true of God's election all along, that the God who elects not to cut down, but to build up, not to divide, but to create the possibility for communion, not to separate people, but to pull them together so that they shall beat their swords into plowshares. That nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war no more. So if at this point human participation in the covenant of grace means that our lives too are called to manifest such electing grace, one way such commitment might become visible, the particular task of the theologian, might then consist in using doctrine as a using of election, reading tradition against tradition in order to turn the instruments of death into instruments of life once more. And where tradition has leveraged affordances that it has found in the grace of God and turned them into swords, we might be called to leverage the same affordances to turn them into plowshares once more. Instruments for the hard work of community, kingdom building, and peace, rather than instruments of enmity and war, instruments of life and growth and flourishing, rather than instruments of death and destruction and devastation. And then using election means working with the materials given, but at the same time in faithfulness to the electio originalis and perpetual hope in the promise of the electio continua, transforming their affordances into ever new designs of grace. Thank you for your attention and for your patience.
Thank you very much, Hanna. Thank you for sticking to time and for a very clear presentation, and I'm sure there's going to be quite a few questions and comments. Thank you. You can take a break now while we listen to our second presentation. And I just need to check, Nadia, did you join us yet? Oh, Nadia, sorry, Nadia will be third. So I would like to just introduce our second speaker who really do not need any introduction. We're all very familiar with his work and with his name, but nevertheless, I thought I would like to say a few words about Rothney Tshaka, who's a colleague to many of us who have worked with us, studied with many of us, and whose work is well known to us. Rothney Tshaka is from a small township on the extreme outskirts of Kimberley called Reichel. He has a BTH from UWC, a MDiv cum laude from Stellenbosch University, a licentiate in theology from Stellenbosch as well, a MTH from Vrije University of Amsterdam, and a PhD at the University of Stellenbosch. He is an alumni of Columbia Theological Seminary. He has taught theology and ethics at Marais Theological College in Zambia. He was an associate professor of ethics and community at the New Brunswick Theological Seminary in New Jersey in the US. He was also chair of the Department of Philosophy, Practical and Systematic Theology, and is currently serving as director of the School of Humanities in the College of Human Sciences at the University of South Africa. Rothney is also an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa. He is one of the founding conveners for the Transatlantic Roundtable on Religion and Race, as well as editorial board member of Black Theology and International Journal. His current research interests are in the fields of Black theology and Black and African studies, Reformed theology, Black and African theologies, and critical race theories. He is a recipient of numerous scholarly awards, including the UNISA Chancellor's Award for Research, and was awarded a C2 rating by the NRF. He has published numerous articles and book chapters on the intersections of theology, race, and politics. Thank you and welcome, Rothney. I give the floor over to you, and you also have between 15 and 18 minutes. I will warn you when you have 5 minutes left, or rather 3 minutes left, to give you a chance to conclude or to wrap up your presentation. Thank you very much.
My colleague, John, thank you for the nice words that you have said. Colleagues, I really feel quite honored to have been invited to be part of this quite auspicious celebration. I would like to first and foremost also have a word of gratitude to the organizers who thought it well to invite me. But I also would like to say a word of special gratitude to the person around whom we have gathered on this occasion, Dirkie Smit. I want to congratulate him on the occasion of his 70th birthday. And so I would like also just to share some reflections, particularly on Dirkie Smit's Warfield lectures, because this was the brief that was given as we prepare to have a conversation this afternoon. So some important lectures of Dirkie Smit that has reference to my brief reflection on this occasion. One, as part of the Warfield series of lectures given in 2018, I would like to signal out one dealing with the doctrine of election with the title, Hope for Even the Most Wretched, Rethinking Election. And two, his inaugural lecture given on the occasion of him occupying the chair of Rima and Ruth, the Free Professor of Reformed Theology and Public Life at Princeton Theological Seminary. And the lecture was titled, Making the Good Confession Before Pontius Pilate, Framed by Politics. In the first lecture herein referred to, he discusses, among others, the insights of Herman Bavinck on the subject of election, and noting especially Bavinck's insistence that even the wretched are included in God's gracious act of election. thereby turning on its head the Pelagian claim which discounted God's grace. Smit presents to his audience the doctrine of election in a rather humanizing manner, forcing even reluctant members of his audience to relook at this quintessential doctrine of the church. The issue of election is to me demonstrated in Smit's submission in a refreshing manner, given the attitudes that many, including myself, had adopted against this doctrine. But this attitude must be understood within particular contexts. The doctrine of election to destination has always been a controversial doctrine, especially for Africans. We shall return to this point in a moment. What for me stood out essentially is Smith's punctuation of context as essential for the reader to understand the positionality of John Calvin on this matter. That Calvin had the refugee in sight as reflected on the grace of God made available through this doctrine. It was thus because of the context of the refugee that this doctrine came to be seen as a code card for those on the margins of society. And thus, this code served the singular purpose of providing them with hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. This hope is made available through the grace of God, even to the most wretched. What is not said clearer in this submission of Smit is a controversy to which I have referred to earlier. Perhaps Smit is deliberately not pointing to these controversies. This is so because he has already chastised the learned treatises that were decorated with what he believes are misappropriations of an otherwise noble doctrine of the church. The fact is that there are attitudes against this doctrine and they are varied, but I would like to point to attitudes particularly among Africans when it comes to this doctrine. The attitude referred to must be understood within particular context, as already alluded, of how this doctrine had come to be applied through the ages. I suspect that this issue of election could probably be among the reasons why the Reformed faith in Africa had never thought it useful to take African worldviews as significant elements of theological reflection and discourse. My reading of this doctrine suggests that it is closely tied up with the question of revelation. In my efforts to provide substance to my claim, allow me to refer briefly to Calvert on this. In his Church Dogmatics, Vol 1/2, Barth concerning revelation says the following: revelation has its own time, which is just this one and not another, which can reach men of all times only as revelation which has entered this time. To this objective particularity in revelation, there corresponds a subjective. The men who received it are quite special men. They are special men not only invisibly and inwardly, but in their very existence, in their visible outward position. In the Old Testament, they belong to the nation with which God had made his covenant, which he has put under his judgment and promise to the nation of Israel. In the New Testament, they belong to the church in which Jesus Christ is present as the real acting subject, as the head of all members gathered in church with their definite task and functions, close quote. But submission is self-evident, yet when he deals with one of the most mysterious aspects of the Christian tradition, such as revelation, he insists that to a certain degree, this mystery is not so much a mystery in that from the biblical text, this has been revealed in Israel and in the Christian church, given the impression that the revelation of God is only confined to the already revealed context of Israel and the church. This has since become the basis for developing positions that place others within and others outside. The Californian historian Forrest Hood, author of the book, The Arrogance of Faith, has taken some time to call out Christianity for having thrived on oppression and racism. Hood argues that Christian thought and conduct in the first 3 centuries of American life came down overwhelmingly on the side of human oppression. He insists that the teachings and practices of the church, according to Aaron Strauss, constituted one of the main sanctions for slavery's perpetuation. Thus, for Hood, the racism of Christianity has been so pervasive that it has always escaped the full force of criticism, a situation encouraged by the fact that a true believer is not likely to acknowledge or even recognize the errors of his faith. And if he did, he saw it as a failure in human conduct, not an inherent flaw of the Christian faith. The result was a society in which the seductive powers of religion were and are formidable, beguiling even the astute. When placing this doctrine into context in South Africa, Smit recognizes especially Black theology of liberation as is evidenced in Boesak, who had refused to give up the Reformed tradition, particularly after having noted the pervasiveness of white racism. This, Smit concludes, can be seen in Boesak's seminal work titled Black and Reform. For Smit, Boesak's insistence on being Black and Reformed is a recalcitrant display that there is something good to be found in the Reformed tradition, even when confronted with misrepresentations of this tradition. Still here, a word is required. The tensions between Black and African theologies had arisen as a result of where the emphasis is placed in their agitation to be heard. It is clear that Black theology, to a great sense, has placed greater emphasis on the political inclusion of Blacks within, while not doing much with regards to calls for recognizing African epistemologies and worldviews as serious aspects of African existence. We know that Black theology itself has not done enough in partnering with the struggles of women and the questions raised by our gay and lesbian brothers. African theology is also not without its challenges, yet what one hopes for is that a formidable covenant between these theologies could be made in the interest of arresting the continuation of Black self-disempowerment. In the second lecture, also indicated in this reflection, what stands out for me is the question of politics. However, this matter is dealt with very cautiously. There are some linkages between this lecture with the previous one already mentioned. The question of hope that is spoken of in both the first and the second is particularly encouraging, crediting Russell Botman for his contribution to the question of hope in a country otherwise plagued with anxiety. A grammar of hope so eloquently noted by Jacques Hervel, who would become a nomenclature that would suggest a particular trajectory for this new South Africa that we had come to inhabit. That hope remains a theological imperative is no doubt, yet it does also mean that hope must be accompanied by sincere acts of justice towards communities that were deliberately marginalized. Otherwise, hope, in my view, becomes an unbearable burden for the souls of the very marginalized. How does one participate in the creation of a grammar of hope when one is continually confronted with what Vuani Willem called zinc forests across a democratic South Africa? These forests are all over our country and they are juxtaposed with opulent communities. These zinc forests are overwhelmingly occupied by Black people. What are these zinc forests? These are shanties made up of corrugated iron, plastic, and basically anything that people can get their hands on to make for themselves shelters and for their families. These are shanty towns that are characterized by squalor and filth with a lack of some of the most basic human needs. Questions of dignity in Sesotho, seriti, or in isiXhosa, isidima, in the face of such conditions are indeed crucial. In fact, these conditions remind me of another wretchedness, once spoken of by Frantz Fanon in his The Wretched of the Earth. It was Fanon's assessment of the situation of the marginalized that led Jean-Paul Sartre to conclude that the status of the native is a nervous condition introduced and maintained by the settler among colonized people with their consent. There are a number of conditions that gang up on this community, both old and new ones. And they act as impediments for a project geared towards a grammar of hope for those who are confined to these locales. My reading of the Reformed tradition suggests a constant renewal of the faith community brought about by the divine interaction between God and his people. It is my view that this is the very reason why the Reformation was a constant activity. This, in my opinion, goes against the spirit of the Reformation, whose original drive was supposed to be a continual awareness and readiness to accept God's ongoing engagement with the people around the world. Or was this interaction supposed to have been ended in the tradition's encounter only with the West? This takes me to the basic point, which would have been addressed in Smit's submission if he had not handled such serious issues with such brevity. What is the significance of the Reformed faith's link to African religiosity? Is it implying that African religiosity is included in the core tenets of the Reformed tradition? Or is it implying that African religiosity is liberated within its tenets? Is African religiosity a decolonized or liberated expression of Reformed faith in today's Africa or not? For Smit, what kept him and his peers interested in Reformed theology was a tendency of reading the tradition against the tradition. In doing that, one can deduce that Smit was attempting to salvage this tradition from the misrepresentation that had hitherto come to characterize this tradition. If Smit was a Gabriel Sitolwane, a Manus Buthelezi, or a Simon Maimela, all of whom had critically engaged the Christian faith through African epistemological lens, and because of the Du Boisian double consciousness which looms large in them, we would have been pardoned for asking, is Smit bewitched by this tradition, as he insists in finding ways of reading it with the intent of displaying the otherwise wholesome good of this tradition. In doing this reading against the tradition, which without a doubt could be construed as somewhat problematic, Smit concludes that all those who had disregarded the tradition had erred in that they had misunderstood the very essence of this tradition. The consequence of that position is that all critical theologies that emerge as attempts at challenging a dominant theology that not only thrived in dissociations, but in fact encouraged them, are rendered moot. So as we listen to him from across the ocean, one can't help but wonder, what was the point of Black theology of liberation? What was the point of African theology, or feminist theology for that matter? As I conclude, as a student of Smit, remembering conversations in which he made his position quite clear, why politics with reference to theology remains problematic, especially to a theological climate where the word is prone to abuse. You can imagine my excitement at the mere mention of the word politics, albeit with relevant qualifications applicable to each context in his reference to the notion. Most clearly, the change of context has allowed him to have greater appreciation of the notion that continues to be viewed with great suspicion in South African Reformed theological circles. I'm reminded of many instances in which we had disagreed with regards to the question of politics or ethics. In the case of Bella, I had argued and continue to argue that Bella was as much a political document as it was a theological document. And so I must also say that I'm much more reminded of the many times that he would shake his head and remind me of Calvin, who had a student of whom thought Calvin was maybe secretly has lost his marbles. And my interactions and disagreements on these issues has always been issues that he had allowed me to have my own view with regards to them. I want to conclude by saying, I am hoping that as we will continue to look at how you perform in the US, we will have new and renewed conversations on the issues that has always kept one up at night. I want to pause here and thank you very much once again for allowing me to participate in this conversation.
Thank you very, very much, Rothney. You have left us with lots to engage with. Thank you for bringing partners, approaches of theology in terms of Black theology, liberation theology, etc., to the conversation table. So thank you so much for that. We will now go over to our final presentation for today before we will engage with discussions. And I'm delighted to introduce Nadia Marais to you. She is a senior lecturer in systematic theology at Stellenbosch University, where she completed her PhD dissertation under the supervision of Professor Dirkie Smit. And her PhD was entitled Imagining Human Flourishing, a systematic theological analysis of contemporary soteriology. Nadia is also an ordained minister in the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa and a Mandela Rhodes Scholar. She is actively involved in the World Communion of Reformed Church, including in the ecumenical dialogue between Reformed and Pentecostal representatives, and by serving on editorial boards of the WCRC's journal Reformed Theology. She remains interested in human and ecological flourishing and publishes regular contributions exploring theological anthropology, soteriology, ecological theology, and rhetorical theology. And thank you, Nadia. Welcome. You have 15 minutes for your presentation. And again, I will remind you when you have 3 minutes left for you to conclude or to draw your discussion to a close. Thank you. Over to you, Nadia.
Thank you so much, Chair. I just want to say I had a heart-stopping moment about 2 minutes ago when I was dropped due to the signal. So I'm just trying to center myself now, but I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the introduction. And it's great to be a part of this celebration. So let me get started. So my contribution is entitled A Fragment Come Alive, ? Not uitverkiesing, but verkiesing, or speaking of election against election. So the rhetoric of election is wrought with so many associations, not only from church life and theology, but also politics, democracy, voting. And I can perhaps just sort of name this, that on November 1st, South Africa heads to the polls again, that I wonder whether our speaking of election is not so much more complex and so much richer than may be evident upon a first consideration. For instance, a recent South African documentary series with the title Devil's Dorp, it appeared earlier this year, tells the frankly terrifying story of a series of murders perpetrated by a South African sect from Krugersdorp that calls themselves Electus Pedeus, God's elect. Their choice of name, their choice for election language, invokes what I suspect lives in the hearts and minds, the public imagination of many South Africans, namely that anyone who dares to call themselves God's elect are not to be trusted. In South Africa, we are, as Professor Smit also notes in his Warfield lectures, very aware of the dangers of speaking of election, and therefore wary and suspicious of any groups that claim to be elected by God. Apartheid theology invested heavily in the rhetoric of election by portraying Afrikaners, that is white Afrikaans-speaking South Africans, as God's elect within the promised land, as part of a larger political and ideological strategy to justify racial segregation and blatant discrimination in service of Afrikaner nationalism. As Smit notes, and I quote, the ways in which the language of election was used and heard in South African Reformed circles became deeply disturbing, and many of the widespread perceptions about ways in which notions of election and covenant functioned in Afrikaner circles are controversial and problematic. Indeed, I quote him again, the so-called myth of a chosen people played a key role and was central to how many people spoke and thought about nationalism in apartheid South Africa, end of quote. This led theologians like Alan Boesak and Russell Botman, Dirkie Smit himself, and many others to learn to read, in his words, the tradition against the tradition. Faith traditions are shared and living, and therefore restless, ever renewing, and ever transforming itself, argues Smit. As he notes, we all belong to communities of interpretation, sharing ways of seeing the world, and we all stand in traditions of interpretation, receiving convictions and values from those before and around us, finding our own way in the world helped by these memories. And so it is here in the context of his argument about living traditions that Dirkie Smit invokes the fascinating image of fragments of these traditions that suddenly come to life. And this was the title that I wanted to use for this contribution as well. By this, he means that such living traditions may suddenly make sense, cast new light, change our perspectives, move us, challenge us, and even transform us in the light of a particular fragment come alive. For such fragments may remind us of roots and histories and figures and events of long ago that become alive and meaningful again in our present, these words. This may invoke a variety of responses from us, ranging from surprise to shock, but most of all, they may, in his words, and to quote him, open up a reservoir of new meanings, a surplus of potential for the future, end of quote. And so, again in his words, I quote, whenever a fragment from the tradition becomes alive like this, other voices may suddenly seem to affirm this understanding. All kinds of other witnesses may seem to support and further strengthen this new interpretation, end of quote, which may lead not only to new interpretations or new histories of reception, but also to new traditions. Smit recognizes this dynamic in the living tradition of the Reformation, perhaps specifically in Reformed confessions, since he invokes the self-same image elsewhere in an essay that explores a Reformed way of dealing with plurality and ambiguity. Come to think of it, he does seem to have a particular affinity for the image of gathering the fragments, since he employs this not only toward interpreting confessions, but also toward interpreting biblical texts. So in a different essay in the same volume, Smit again invokes this image, borrowed from David Tracy, in thinking through some of the rhetorical, ethical, and hermeneutical dynamics at play in reading the Bible. As Smit notes in his essay, for Tracy, this expression is part of a bigger project wherein he explores, I quote, finding some way of living with radical plurality, end of quote. As such, in Smit's words, I quote, it is the search behind the blessed rage for order within the diversity. It is the power of the analogical imagination to recognize similarity amidst difference, and therefore to make meaningful conversation possible between different traditions. It is the religious hope that empowers people caught in the pluralities and ambiguities of method, history, and language. It is the dialogues, albeit sometimes one of silence, with the other, end of quote. Yet, it is not just fragments in general, or just any kind of fragment that piques Smit's interest in his retirement lecture from Stellenbosch University and in his Warfield lectures at Princeton Theological Seminary. It is in his words, I quote, one particular fragment of the tradition that came to life in my own biography, end of quote, namely that of election. Moreover, it is not just any interpretation of election, such as the complex scholastic debates about predestination and double predestination, infralapsarianism and supralapsarianism, that interests Smit, but specifically election as God's free grace and acceptance of us all, but in particular those most wretched. Smit sees in Herman Bafing's gereformeerde dogmatiek, his Reformed dogmatics, and Willie Jonker's uit Vrye Guns Alleen, from Grace Alone or from Free Grace Alone, a shared pastoral concern for the elendiges, the wretched, in their respective portrayals of the doctrine of election. For Dutch theologian Herman Bafing, election is a rich comfort that ultimately falls beyond the scope of our words, not only for believers, but also for unbelievers, writes Bafing. As such, Bavinck resists what he regards as the overwhelming position that election, he uses the word uitverkiesing, as sometimes occupied in theology and practice, church practice, notes Willie Jonker. For Bavinck, the gospel is preached to people, not to the elect and the reprobate, but to sinners who are all in need of salvation. In his accentuation of election in Christ, his resistance to an eternal decree wherein there is no room for God as the decision-making God, and in his critique of the parallel approach to divine election and divine rejection, Bavinck is arguably speaking of election against election. I quote, this is also a quote that Dirkie Smit uses, Pelagianism has no pity. One of the quotations from Bavinck that Smit uses multiple times in both his retirement lecture and the Warfield lectures. A description that is directed again against the charge that election is hard and merciless, cruel and terrifying. For Stellenbosch systematic theologian Willie Jonker, I quote, this doctrine only functions in a doxological context as praise, born in wonder and gratitude for God's free grace in Christ and through the Spirit, end of quote, writes Smit. For Jonker, again a quote, election is the mystery and foundation of the good news of the gospel. For the Reformed tradition, the central message of salvation and the heart of the church. South African theologian Piet Nadia observes that the pastoral intent evident in all of Jonker's theology is nowhere more clear than in his engagement with the doctrine of election. Already in this book's title, By Grace Alone, Jonker's pastoral motive, namely to comfort or console, is evident, argues Nadia. So Piet Nadia writes, he also argues that this book, the specific book on election, illustrates the nature of Jonker's dogmatics as a pastoral dogmatics in the tradition of Augustine and Noordmans. Nadia notes that the doctrine of election is the one doctrine within dogmatics that is so often led to overly logical and systematic or systematizing arguments, but which Jonker has opted to approach with a pastoral focus and in agreement with a pastoral motivation that is evident in much of his scholarly work. After all, Jonker describes election as the culmination of the gospel. Herman Bavinck, Willie Jonker, and Dirkie Smit's concern with a pastoral approach to the doctrine of election, the deep concern for how this may reshape our theological rhetoric of election into a grammar of life, is echoed by others as well. Two small examples may perhaps serve to elaborate upon this observation. Princeton systematic theologian Ellen Cherry has argued for the pastoral function of Christian doctrine in her By the Renewing of Your Minds, published in 1999. In this prequel to her God and the Art of Happiness, published in 2010, Cherry argues, and I quote, that classical doctrinal theology is pastoral motivated and that its end is human flourishing, end of quote. Systematic theology is shaped by a twofold concern, namely a doctrinal concern and a pastoral concern, exactly because, in her words, doctrines shape a way of life that forms people for living their lives excellently, end of quote. Cherry notes that the modern construal of truth, which was more interested in intellectual coherence than in goodness, gave rise to Protestant scholasticism and its drive towards intellectual performance, systematizing, and academizing, her word. Yet, I quote again, the pastoral agenda of theology has not disappeared, she argues, since it is clearly recognizable in the argument, the rhetoric, even the structure in, for example, Friedrich Schleiermacher's Glaubenslehre and Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics. Her book on happiness stands in this tradition, she writes. Thank you. Namely, for the sake of God's great yes. Yale theologian David Kelsey echoes the concern for a pastoral agenda of theology in his book entitled Imagining Redemption, but describes this somewhat differently. Kelsey prefers to combine aspects of what he calls two types of theology, systematic theology and pastoral theology. Yet it is clear that herein Kelsey echoes Cherry's argument for the pastoral function of Christian doctrine. For as he notes in his Imagining Redemption, in this book, He is concerned with a very specific set of tragic circumstances, of wretchedness, of ellende. It is this self-same pastoral concern that I heard in Dirkie Smit's lectures on election. As it so happened, I was able to attend the lectures that framed the session's discussion about election, namely the retirement lecture at Stellenbosch University in 2017 and the Warfield lectures in Princeton in 2018. But as has pretty much always been the case, I've seen and learned new and surprising even accentuations and subtleties in his work upon a close reading of these respective texts that has perhaps deepened the impression that Smit's imaginative rethinking and reinterpretation of the doctrine of election is pastorally bent toward comfort, care, well-being, flourishing. I recall a conversation we had in Princeton after the first Warfield lecture on election theology. I referred to the Uitverkiesingsleer, which is the usual translation of doctrine of election in Afrikaans. Professor Smit hesitated a moment and then told me that he prefers verkiesingsleer over uitverkiesingsleer in Afrikaans. So in other words, without the inclusion of uit, which means out. And so I've wondered since, and also in preparing this reflection over the past few days, whether that is not a very helpful and important distinction for imagining God's electing grace. Professor Smit is, after all, a masterful rhetorician and a skilled rhetorical theologian. The importance of carefully selecting words, as has been evident throughout the symposium, is of the highest priority in his thought and work. This is also very clearly the case in his rethinking of the doctrine of election. The very title of his Warfield lectures include the reference to speaking of election. And as he has so often argued, but also here in speaking of election, how we speak matters. Our words, what they do to and in and for others matter. We can wield them as weapons that wound and traumatize and destroy. We can offer them as balms and salves that soothes and binds up and heals. We can speak in clever ways about election as, and I quote, a plaything for theologians. We can position our speaking and choose our words to comfort and console, encourage and care, so that the wretched, the ellendiges, the sinners, the beggars, in short, those most in need of it, for, and I quote, wretchedness has many faces, do not lose hope at encountering our words. So the rhetorical implication of uitverkiesing is that election is set in the key or to the beat of inclusion and exclusion. Some are in while others are out. Uitverkiesing implies a theological logic that has already set course for double predestination, perhaps not in fully fledged form, but nonetheless on a clear trajectory toward an interpretation of God's grace that elects and rejects. As Willionke remarks, a rational approach to election, again the word uitverkiesing, that is more interested in logical conclusions than in the proclamation of God's grace to all people, misses not only the very roots of this doctrine, namely soteriology, but also the fruits of this doctrine, namely well-being, flourishing, and joy. If we take a pastoral approach to the doctrine of election seriously, we beware the arc that bends toward rejection as an equally possible, equally plausible, equally theological destiny to God's electing grace. I wonder whether we have any use anymore for double predestination. With all that we know in South Africa and beyond about how the language of reprobation is used to exclude, discriminate, and violate, can we afford to maintain even a semblance of neutrality in our speaking of election? And so, even if we could, ought we concern ourselves with double predestination? It is a question that I think about a lot, and I would love to hear how participants in this symposium think about this as well. I am ending off, Chair. I'm close to being done, sorry. So after all, as Barfink notes, and this is my own translation of the Dutch, election does not deserve, as it has so often been preached, to repulse the many, but rather to invite all to the richness of God's grace in Christ. Nobody may believe that they are rejected, because each and every person is seriously and urgently called and is therefore required to believe in the Christ that saves. Nobody can believe that they are rejected, because their own life and everything and everyone that they enjoy and love is proof that God has no appetite for their death. Moreover, nobody really believes, he argues, that they are rejected, since then it would already be hell on earth for them. But election is a source of comfort and power, of humility, of trust and decisiveness. The salvation of human beings is fixed, unshakably so, in the gracious and almighty goodwill of God. So friends and colleagues, it's a privilege and an honor to join you today for the celebration of Dirkie Smit's 70th birthday. I am deeply indebted to Professor Smit for his mentorship and guidance as a lecturer during our undergraduate years, as a supervisor over the course of my postgraduate years, and later also as my doctor father and senior colleague in the department. So I want to say just a few words in Afrikaans. Veel geluk, professor. Dankie dat soveel van ons soveel by prof kon leer oor al die jare. Prof se erfenis en nalatenskap strek verder, breër en dieper as wat ek dink prof dalk besef. Mag prof ook in hierdie jaar gedei. I mean, if Roger Federer can go for his 21st slam, then my wish for all of us here celebrating your life and work is to many more years of learning from you, listening to you, and deepening reflection about the words that really matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I already echo the sentiments expressed in our in the chat that these three presentations were brilliant. It calls us to reimagine the doctrine of election and to rethink it in particular context and what it means for us today, and how do we make sense and meaning of it, so that all people can find this as meaning-making as possible. Thank you, colleagues, also for your patience, for listening. We have about 25 minutes, a good 25 minutes, for any questions, any comments. Please put your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A. But also, if you'd like to verbalize your question, please indicate to me, and Dion will unmute you. Thank you very much. I wonder, there is one question in the chat. It is quite a long question, and Hanna, you are the first person to ask a question, and you may, would you mind if we unmute you and you ask your question verbally?
Well, the question is from me for Hanna.
Yes.
So
I
Hanna,
see. Oh, I see. I
yeah.
see. Thank you.
Hi. Hanna, years ago, I was at Princeton Seminary and as assistant for the professors there teaching theology. And the Monday and the Wednesday, they would do their lectures. On the Monday, the lecture was on how Calvin got it wrong. And on Wednesday, the lecture was on how Barth got it right. And then on Friday, when I had my small group, I messed with their minds and said, do you really think Barth's solving the problem? Because the way that the doctrine of election was classically formulated, if I understand it right, and maybe I've never understood it, and you can explain to me why not, but it deals with that anthropological aspect. We believe in a sort of a limited salvation. I mean, you don't have to believe in it, but traditionally the church has said that outside of the church, there's no salvation. So if you believe in that, but you also believe in the primacy of grace, how do you put those two together? And that election is about that in the classical formulation. So help us understand how Barth solves that, because as a non-Barth person, I've never been able to wrap my mind around my brain around that.
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I'm not as much interested in the question whether Barth got it right or not. But let's think about the question of election, right? I'm not sure if the original intent is limiting salvation. I mean, of course, it has often been used that way, but the way I understand the doctrine of election, it comes out of the other thing that you highlighted, right? The this conviction about the primacy of grace, and this recognition that actually God is gracious and is loving and desires community with the human being. And God is powerful, even sovereign, right? To also make that possible despite all the potential resistance or challenge that such a vision might encounter, even from the human side or from, the larger reality of sin. So in that sense, I mean, the question is, what do we understand by universalism? I know that, and I think for good reason, right? The tradition has rejected the understanding that everything and everyone will unilaterally and unequivocally be saved. Partially, I think, because that also doesn't sit right with our experience of reality as fundamentally in need of redemption, as fundamentally not all good. So there also needs to be kind of a break and a kind of a doing away with parts of our reality if we want to think about something that is worthy to call it salvation and grace and redemption. Yet I think the deeper insight that, right, there is this desire of God for community, and maybe with the words of Paul in Romans 8, right, we believe that there is nothing that can divide us from this love. We believe that God's power is such that God's love can overcome whatever kinds of division stand in the way of actualizing and realizing this love. And could we think of election in this positive sense, right, as this determination to make this communion happen? I think that does open a universal horizon, and I think that horizon is much like, even in the particular biblical traditions that talk about the election of Israel, we have this kind of universal horizon of all the peoples coming. In the story of Jesus of Nazareth, we have a very particular contextual ministry and also a kind of opening up of that horizon. So I mean, I think regardless of the question whether Bart was right in how he formulated out the doctrine of election particularly, I think his hunch to say we can't just like teach universal salvation, but we can also not teach this universal horizon. That's kind of correct, right? If we do believe in this love of God and the sovereign grace, then who are we to put limits to that? And so, right, kind of coming from this angle, rather than turning it into a cast in stone, everything is already okay and no worries about anything, which doesn't seem right, right? To think of it as this hopeful horizon of overcoming whatever stands in the way of God's grace and desire for community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still going to continue struggling with, whether Bart solves the original anthropological problem, but that's always my critique. But I love your language of hopeful horizon, so thank you. That's very helpful. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, there is a question from Hanna Bleher, if that is how I pronounce your surname correctly, and it is to you, Hanna, as well. So perhaps I will read the question. Is that fine? All right. Many thanks for the stimulating thoughts and presentations. I have a question regarding the design theoretical approach to Hanna Reichel. As an interpretive lens, I find it extremely enriching, but I wonder, in the context of the doctrine of election, what is the concrete analogy to design? ? Is it the doctrine itself, the electing action of God, i.e. election itself? I had the impression that you drew the analogy very differently. Is that perhaps even the potency of the design theoretic approach, that it can be applied to all the relations of actors, agents, subjects, and objects? If so, is there any need to talk about design at all? Or isn't it more of an actor network theory that you are describing? That was for you, Hanna. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very good question. And then I admit that I've been using the analogy in a way that it's shifted a bit over the course of my talk, right? So in some ways, I've used the design parallel to, like, when talking about the electio originalis, to kind of point to, in a way, God's self-determination as the original design, right? God making God's self into this kind of God, into this thing that then has particular affordances in relation. And I've partially used it to refer to very humanly crafted things like doctrines, right? This is a design. It has been, like the doctrine, just like the blade, has been potentially designed for a specific purpose. And we might, in some regard, also discern the best kind of use for it. And at the same time, there always remains like a kind of bandwidth of potential uses, and it has much to do with who we are and how we interact with the object as well. What I really like about the design lens is that it allows you to formulate very strong intentionality and vision, right? As a designer designs something on the one hand, and yet that is not mutually exclusive with the agency and activity of others, and with also a kind of contingency. And I think that's just very realistic. So, right, it gives us a framework where we can think in, where we can talk in very strong ways of God's intention and God's design, without that in any way becoming deterministic. And I think that's one of the pitfalls of traditional framings of a doctrine of election, or even, right, of creation and sovereign grace in other frameworks, that it typically leads to this questions, well, but if there is a will of God and then things come about this way, then is there any room for human freedom? And I think the design parallel gives us a very good way to conceive of both at the same time. That's one of the things I really like about it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks, Hanna. Here's Hanna as well. Yeah, but my maybe one re-question. Maybe it's more about a relational turn than you are, elaborating than a design approach, isn't it?
Can you tell me more how these would be different things?
Because the design, I think it's more about a product or an object that has maybe an epistemic or also other potential than this interacting and non-deterministic approach that you are describing. So I see in this a more relational turn, maybe, but I'm not sure if this is your emphasis.
Well, I would understand it in a wider sense also as a relational model. And I mean, you invoked actor network theory or other kinds of models. I think there are plenty of good models that point us into a more relational and interrelated way of thinking. And I think they're very fruitful. The design thing became useful for me, especially when I was thinking about the work of theology. So it's not only, I'm as a theologian, I mean, in this case, as a kind of meta reflection on my own work, I'm not only thinking about God's relationship to the human being, I'm also thinking about how we as theologians conceptualize that. And so and for me, it has become useful to think of the work that we do, the intellectual conceptual work, as a kind of work of conceptual design. But that is, in some ways, it's a metaphor. In some ways, it's an analogy. In some ways, I think it's fruitful. And it's also not the only way one can think about these things.
Okay, thank you. This was, enriching. Thanks for your answer.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions, colleagues? If there's not, can I perhaps just invite Rothney to perhaps give just a few sentences with regard to the conversation that Black theology can have with Dirkie Smit's perspective of the doctrine of election. Just perhaps a few thoughts, because I found it very interesting, and I was wondering, with the emergence, re-emergence, I would say, of Black theology, I would personally be very interested in that.
John, thank you for putting me on the spot. But I think there are a number of things that really frustrates one when it comes to these kinds of conversations. When it comes to the templates that for a long time has meant to give direction with regards to how the church is supposed to organize itself, and I'm finding them very problematic, because I find that almost in all of these doctrines, Black lived experiences are supposed to be interpolated. We have to read themselves into that. and the issue that I had tried to reflect upon of election, I have indicated that it is a matter that for me really, if you're a Black person and if you know what has been said about Black people in the past, it is not something that you just gravitate towards. And I find that Dirkie is not doing enough really to pause a little bit and to speak to some of the acknowledged misrepresentations. He is quite aware of that. But again, Dirkie is a very dear doctor father of mine. I know he doesn't easily come to these invitations that you want to try to get him to. So he might even never respond to that. But I think I do want to speak to the fact that in his presentation, you then get a sense that what was the point of having critical theologians therefore? So if no one else has had the information that I have had and many other people have had, and you would hear these presentations that Smit has shared with us, you're bound to ask you these questions. What's the point of these things then? And so I do think that perhaps there needs to be an opportunity to acknowledge these things and to say, even if it's in a footnote, but it needs to come because they are part of our existence. So maybe the reform faith in South Africa will really have to take stock of the fact that it is, as I've said, it has never thought it necessary to really become a faith that is off the ground, that is of Africa, that learns of things that we were not encouraged to learn of the other. And I think that is the thing that frustrates me about it, that you have a reform faith that remains as white as it was in the past. And that is also fueled by the many misconceptions of the other that I don't think get enough to be dealt with in these kinds of conversations.
Thank you very much, Rothney. Thank you, I appreciate that. Christo Lombard, do you have your question ready? Please, you are unmuted. You may pose your question.
Yeah, thank you very much to everyone. The presentations were so beautiful, beautiful people, beautiful theology. I want to link up with Nadia's whole thrust of her own theology. I'm now teaching Old Testament at the moment, and the debates between von Rad and Westermann about creation theology. And so von Rad was the one who said it's about election. The whole Bible is about election and redemption. And of course, Bart followed up on that very strongly. And then Westermann and Smit and other people in the Old Testament field said, no, but what about blessing? What about what about the purpose of revelation and the purpose of election? Is grace and election and even righteousness, are they not all in service of blossoming, of blessing, of full life? Have we not lost our ability to speak to the scientists and about evolution and about ecology and so on by only focusing on election and redemption? So Nadia's whole theology seems to be linking this line of election, redemption, and faith and so with the purpose of all of that, that is full humanity, full blossoming. So I would just like to hear her comment on this. Have we not been jumping on one leg, so to speak, in our theology.
Thanks, Nadia. You may respond.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Christu. It's nice to hear your voice. And thank you also for this comment, question. I mean, of course, I absolutely agree. It made me think of, in Ellen Cherry's book, God and the Art of Happiness, she has a section on the Psalter and how the Psalter speaks about flourishing and well-being. But one of the headings that she uses is the heading, the joy of election. So she says that in the Psalter, the sort of tone of voice, or we could say perhaps the sort of musical key or the rhythm to which election is discussed, election theology, and specifically the election of Israel, is in this tone of well-being, of this is a source of joy, of comfort. She, I think, uses the Hebrew word ashrei in that section. So I actually think that there are people that have been doing such linking work, and for me, her book has been a really rich source of just new ways of thinking about Christian doctrine, and including the doctrine of election. So I think it's a great comment, and I think already that I agree with you. So so thanks.
Thank you, Christu. Thank you, Nadia. I just read to you this chat that's directed to you, Rothney, in appreciation of your presentation. I really appreciate that critical take, Professor Tshaka, and think that a parallel problem exists in the Reformed tradition in North America with respect to indigenous peoples and the African diaspora in North America. Greetings from New Brunswick Theological Seminary. We'll take that as a comment. Thank you very much, Nathan, for that. We do have about 3 minutes for maybe one question and a response. Otherwise, I will give, if you so wish, to the speakers each maybe 30 seconds for a very last thought, and then we will close the session. So just one more question, and then I don't see any hands. I don't see anybody else. So Hanna, Rothney, or Nadia, if you so wish, you have 30 seconds just to give us a few sentences in conclusion.
Everyone is keeping their camera off, so it's difficult to look at each other and see who will go first. I don't know if I have any final words. I will just say that for me, these Warfield lectures were absolutely a moment of inspiration, and I'm deeply grateful for the gift that Dirk Smit has given us in this way of wrestling with the traditions we have inherited, both faithfully and stubbornly sticking to them, despite better insight maybe sometimes, but insisting to undermine them until they yield a blessing. I find that very inspiring.
John, I remember Dirkie used to say to me while I was doing my PhD, I guess maybe out of like exasperation, that Rothney, we are busy, we're busy having a barbecue on a little bokkie here, and then you would go off and come back with a buffalo. so I must say, maybe that's because I always wanted to have a response to things, but there's one thing that I've learned from what he said one day, and he said to me, one day, Rothney, I hope you will understand that it is easy to ask questions than to provide solutions. And so I really appreciate the old man for having had the patience that he had with me. Also the fact that you don't find it, always in a supervisor, a person who wants you to be yourself and not to make of you a mini me of him. And so that will always be something that I treasure about Smit.
Thank you very much. Some other words of appreciation. Thank you so much. So we're going to conclude, and I'm going to give over to Robert in a while to take us through what happens next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, also for chairing the session, and also for leading us further into the discussion after these wonderful presentations. We now have a break again, also like yesterday, till 5 o'clock, when we will rejoin. You can just all rejoin with that link. And we are then actually looking forward to the next session as well, where we will think further about the legacy, also in conversation with people working through his work, Professor Smit's work, and using it also in their own research. And then we will have a time for commendations and also a response by Prof. Smit. So thanks all for participating, for joining this session, and we look forward then to see you all at 5 o'clock again.